If you shut down the entire global economy for 6 months, we will probably start to see a sell-off early Jan or late Dec because people are expecting something, and I think it will be wholeheartedly wrong. I think the flippening has not a high probability, a decent probability. It was about October 2020 that I had been following the Ethereum chart, and I looked at it and thought, this looks like it's going to break out. I then looked at the Bitcoin Ethereum chart and I realized that it was forming a pattern that looked like it was going to break out. Using my probabilistic odds and charts, which is what we talked about at the beginning, this looks interesting. So I posted it on Twitter, and what happens was an immense backlash. So when somebody does something like that to say, I refuse you to think along those lines, I will always go down that, I'm a contrarian by nature. So then I started looking at Bitcoin. Then I looked at the chart of Ethereum when it had the same number of wallet addresses as Bitcoin. And I realized it's exactly the same price. And the charts look identical. And then I started looking at other assets, and they started looking like they were Bitcoin, but from the 2017 cycle, and Ethereum looked like Bitcoin from the 2017 cycle. And I'm like, why do these all look the same? Realized that it was to do with Metcalfe's law and network adoption models, and that they were all following the same path. And therefore, there was no difference between Bitcoin and Ethereum from an investor's point of view. You may have a philosophical opinion, but at this phase, when we're talking about the adoption of these assets, they're all the same. And it all depends on what's getting the adoption for whatever purposes, whatever reason. Solana has adoption for a different reason than Ethereum does. That has a different reason to Bitcoin. Doesn't matter. So that's when I started allocating to Bitcoin, Ethereum, because I now understood a pricing model, understood the whole space in more detail, and I realized that almost nobody else was seeing it in these terms. And then as I started getting conviction in the price, I was being rewarded for taking the bet, I started switching more and more out. And then my final anticipation, the action that happened today, which was finally the ETH Bitcoin chart broke that 0.08 level, which I had been expecting because I knew that chart pattern. That's the classic wedge pattern that I keep talking about. I knew that the probability was extremely high. So therefore I had to reduce my Bitcoin as much as possible. Not that I don't like Bitcoin, to your point. It's because I loved Ethereum more at this point. And there'll be another point in another couple of years, I'll be poo-pooing Ethereum because I find something else with a bigger opportunity. I'm an investor.
If I had to ask you of those three, Bitcoin 2013 pattern, PlanB stock to flow, or 1970s gold from Fidelity, which would you pick? Or a mix of all three?
I think that I first wrote a paper on the stock to flow of Bitcoin in 2013 versus gold. So I understand that. And when PlanB did it properly, because he's a much smarter guy than me, I intuitively understand what he was doing. And I thought it was genius. And I still think it gives us a good framework. We all know that nothing works perfectly, but it gives us a very good framework of understanding. I think it's also showing essentially Metcalfe's law within that. I have been using the 2013 Bitcoin chart for a year and a half now. It's worked very well. I also know that those things fail just when you expect them the most to work. It gives me conviction. So I'm looking at the chart pattern. I'm looking at the flow from all the institutions I'm seeing. I'm looking at the stock to flow, Metcalfe's law, that chart pattern from 2013. It's backed up by the ETH chart pattern versus Bitcoin. That's going to give me about the most conviction. I only saw the gold chart recently. Paul Tudor Jones had alluded to it before. I saw the gold chart recently, and it's like, these are all crowd-based behavioral patterns that are playing out. And we will probably start to see a sell-off early Jan or late Dec because people are expecting something. And I think it will be wholeheartedly wrong because I see nothing but a wall of money coming in Jan, Feb, March. I also think that the ETH staking cycle has changed the structure of markets. It may even be more dominant eventually than the Bitcoin halving cycle. When most people think they've figured it out, it all changes. It happens endlessly. So I'm thinking, what is the path of most pain? Because every person now thinks, well, what I'll do is I'll reduce my exposure in December, I'll keep hold of some, and then I'll buy it back at the bottom when it's down 80%. I know how to do this. So the likelihood is it doesn't go down that far, and it repeats what we saw this year, which was big run, decent sized sell-off, takes 6 months before it takes out the high, screams for a new high again, everyone panics in, sells off again, and it keeps going up in this jagged pattern to new highs because we're now at the teeth of the adoption curve. Central bank digital currencies, institutions, Twitter, Facebook, everybody's starting to see the adoption. So I think it's going to change the structure, and it's going to be a bit harder because we had this nice, neat narrative that I think is going to fall apart. And also, just to put it in perspective, the network growth is currently at about 113% a year across the whole digital digital asset ecosystem, right? At 150, 200 million users, we get to 1 billion people by 2024. That's the nature of exponential maths. Now, 1 billion people from here, we can't get our heads around it. But that's why I don't think we can have the 80% fall. Again, I'm using base case probabilities, no certainties. I still think ETH finishes this year closer to 15,000 than to 10,000. Just by the nature of what is actually going on right now and the chart patterns and, the people who are coming into the space. I actually still see ETH potentially, the small probability upside is that it hits 40,000 by the summer. That's because of the staking cycle and how the charts look, and using the log chart, extending it forwards, and a number of things give me that. It's not my base case. My base case would be 20,000 ETH. I think the ratio is changing, and it's going to go to something significantly different than, so if it's 12 now, probably goes to 7, 6. So I think that's what that ETH Bitcoin chart is telling me. So I think that relationship's going to shift over time.
6 is flippening territory.
Yes, exactly. I think we're going to, my guess is this cycle, we don't get a proper elongated bear market. And by an elongated bear market, I'm not talking down 80, I'm talking about down 50 and it stays down for 9 months and bores everybody out kind of thing. I think that happens when the flippening happens, and we'll readjust again and Bitcoin will become the larger asset. I think the flippening has not a high probability, a decent probability in the next 9 months. Look at Bitcoin. It is riddled with its own restrictions because of its perfection in what it does. So you have to build the lightning layer to do any transactions because it's useless for transaction. And it can't do big block sizes, it can't do fast, it can't do a lot of things. ETH comes along, it can do all of those things. But now ETH may not be fast enough, good enough, secure enough, whatever, to do different things. So like Bitcoin, we're seeing these things being built on, but it's a bit late. So Ethereum may build some of this stuff on, but it may be used elsewhere, which is kind of what you're alluding to. Probably. But will people stop using Ethereum? Highly unlikely at this state. I cannot see into the future, because once you've got interoperability, if people decide that some other new chain is better, you can basically migrate everything across chain. We haven't got our heads around that yet, so chains can die pretty quick. I have thought about it in Bitcoin. We talked about it in the beginning, the pristine collateral store of value versus the call option. I just decided that Metcalfe's law works better, because that store of value component becomes much more obvious once the adoption is more saturated, because the pronounced effect, and you could see it in the volatility of the asset, is that the call option is currently the main feature. So go back to our conversation earlier, does it act like a risk on or risk off? It currently acts like a risk on. Not perfectly, it's not utterly correlated, and it's because with that part of the adoption curve, as you said, we're coming up like this, the exponential part, so it's going to be all in the value of the call option. That's why I'm buying it. Other people are buying it all for the value of the final adoption. Again, I have no issue with people, even the Bitcoin maximalist idea that this could be the base layer of money for the world. I understand that. I can hold that probability in my head, but that has to happen further up the adoption curve, because nobody can own a store of value that has a 70% volatility. It doesn't make any sense to anybody. If you shut down the entire global economy for 6 months and we avoided the big reset by the trick of monetary debasement, then there is no reset that can happen. It just simply, they have made the decision they cannot allow the collateral layer to go bust. You do that by debasing your currency. The collateral layer is equities, credit, bonds, real estate. So they are not, it is verboten now to allow those to go down.
Nice word.
So the answer is printing of more money. So what we're seeing is, I think, the actual outcome, which is a migration to this new digital world. So as we all migrate to what we now perceive as, okay, this world of digital assets is a safer place for our savings, investments, and place to build our businesses, then we will migrate over time. So it ends with a whimper, not a bang. Yeah, and I would happily hold Bitcoin. I just thought Ethereum probably do better than Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin, if you want to be in the space and you don't really know what to do and you want to have a long-term investment, Bitcoin's absolutely perfect. Beautiful. Will it go up, as racily as it did in the past? No, its rate of return will come down over time. That's okay. It's still good. It's an amazing asset.